Okay, let's continue and talk about approaches to the study of nationalism in India. This is the second video. So, in this video, we'll talk about era of mass nationalism. In the previous video, talked about that how Indian nationalist movement was restricted to the educated class, and uh, uh, and this educated class was kind of created by the British when it introduced actually Western education, and the British used Western education as a tool to actually to create a kind of buffer class between it on one hand and the Indian masses on the other hand. So this was a kind of buffer class. Let's talk about era of mass nationalism here. So it actually began with the arrival of Gandhi from South Africa to India in 1915, and then Mahatma Gandhi's subsequent visits to Champaran and other places of India, and his sympathy with the farmers and downtrodden people of India. So the era of mass nationalism, as I have just told you, began with the arrival of Gandhi, and the elite dominance continued until the end of World War One, when for the first time Mahatma Gandhi flung open the gates of constitutional politics to initiate the new era of mass nationalism. This is how Bandhopadhya argues. Okay. Next point Bandhopadhya argues is Cambridge School. So it says, if the new traditionalist historians studied Indian politics within the framework of the province, a few others have tracked these divisions further down to the level of localities. These later writings, which have come to be identified as the Cambridge School, have questioned the ontology or structure of a unified nationalist movement and have traced instead only a series of localized movements in colonial India. As imperialism was weak since it could not function without the help of Indian collaborators, nationalism, according to the Cambridge School, that grew out of contestation or in opposition of imperialism with it was weak as well. As imperial rule depended on Indian collaborators, there was competition among them for favor of colonial rulers. So let's move to the next point, and this point we can term it patron-client relationship, all about bargaining for patronage, political patronage from the British. So the national movement was led by these self-seeking leaders entirely to pursue their narrow individual or clannish interests. Leaders at various levels were tied through patron-client relationships and were through these vertically structured or top-down loyalty networks that they bargained with the British for power and patronage. This school, in other words, completely de-recognizes the role of a nationalist ideology and seeks to explain nationalist politics in terms of a competition collaboration syndrome. India was not a nation but an aggregate of disparate or different interest groups, and they were united as they had to operate within a centralized national administrative framework created by the British. Let's move to this orthodox Marxist school. Orthodox Marxist school sought to analyze the class character of the nationalist movement and tried to explain it in terms of the economic developments of the colonial period, primarily the rise of industrial capitalism and the development of a market society in India. It identified the bourgeois leadership which directed this movement to suit their own class interests and neglected the interests of the masses and even to some extent betrayed them, deceived them. This narrow class approach and economic determinism, that economy determines everything and rest of the things are simply superstructures, and this economic determinism of the early Marxists like R.P. Dutt and Soviet historian V.I. Pavlu were qualified in later Marxist writings of S.N. Mukherjee, Sumit Sarkar, and Bipin Chandra. S.N. Mukherjee pointed out the complexities of nationalism, its multiple layers and meanings, the importance of caste along with class, and the simultaneous use of traditional as well as a modern language of politics. Then we have got this argument, Sumit Sarkar. He recognizes the legitimacy of nationalism but does not ignore the internal tensions within it. There were two levels of anti imperialist struggle in India, he contends, the one elite and the other populist belonging to ordinary Indian citizens. One need not ignore either of the two, but look at the complex interaction of these two levels, through which was produced the pattern of continuity through change that constituted the dominant theme of period. Now we have got here radical Marxist school. So a brave new interpretation in this debate came in 1982 when the first volume of the Subaltern Studies edited by Ranjit Guha was published, and with a provocative opening statement. The statement goes like this: the historiography of Indian nationalism has for a long time been dominated by elitism. This blinkered or narrow approach historiography cannot explain Indian nationalism because it simply neglects the contribution made by the people or ordinary people on their own, that is, independently of the elite, to the making and development of this nationalism. This radical Marxist school, which derives its theoretical inputs from the writings of Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, thinks that organized national movement, which ultimately led to the formation of the Indian nation state, was hollow nationalism of the elites. Hollow nationalism of the elites, while real nationalism was that of the masses. So the key argument of radical Marxist school is this, that Indian nation state was hollow nationalism of the elites because it talked about them, and while real nationalism was that of the masses whom it calls the subaltern. Let's move to the next point. Gyan Prakash and post-colonial theory. The subaltern view of nationalism, or what is now being described as a major strand in post-colonial theory, has witnessed further development in Gyan Prakash's most recent book, Another Reason, that was published in 1999, where he has argued in partial revision of Chatterjee that there was no fundamental opposition between the inner sphere of the nation and its outer life as a nation state. The fashioning or constructing of the nation state in India was no mere emulation of the Western model as thought by Chatterjee, but a rethinking and critiquing of the Western modernity from the vantage point or perspective of India's spiritual cultural heritage combined with a scientific approach. This state, as contemplated by leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, would be guided by the Indian principles of ethical conduct that privileged collective good, and in this sense it would not be a Western import. However, this very reliance on the state emanated from their failure to achieve national unity, which they had only visualized at a discursive level. Thus, as Gyan Prakash argues, the nation state was eminent or inherent in the very hegemonic project of imagining and normalizing a national community, and herein lay the contradiction of Indian nationalism. Here we have got some concluding remarks. Indian nationalism is an intensely contested discursive terrain from where it's difficult to arrive at a middle ground or evolve a kind of wide ranging view or an extensive view that would be acceptable to all. So it remains contested. The entire Indian historiography remains contested. If British rule sought to colonize Indian minds, the Indians also selectively appropriated, internalized, and manipulated that colonial knowledge to mount their own resistance to colonial hegemony. Now we have got few discordant voices or few voices which were conflicting voices. So, if mainstream nationalism assumed the existence of a homogeneous nation that supposedly spoke with one voice, there have been persistent claims about exclusion, silences, and suppression of differing voices, such as those of women or Dalits. It's now argued by an ever increasing group of historians that the forms of anti colonial resistance and the ideologies that went behind them were visualized or constructed in multiple ways. Ania Luma's observation, Bandhopadhya actually brings in here. She says the nation itself is a ground of dispute. The nation itself is a ground of dispute and debate, a site for the competing imaginings of different ideological and political interests. So, India was a plural society, and therefore, Indian nationalism bound to have many voices as different classes, groups, communities, and regions interpreted their nation in various, sometimes even contradictory ways. Indians had many identities like class identity, caste identity, religious identity, and soon at different historical conjunctures, different identities were articulated and intersected with the colonial state. It sought to reinforce and substantialize these fissures, these internal contradictions or differences. The Indian nationalists tried to publicize an alternative discourse of integration. Despite the fact that there were internal fissures, internal differences, Indian nationalists they tried to project India as a unified nation. Jawaharlal Nehru talked about the old Indian ideal of a synthesis of differing elements and their fusion into a common nationality and their combination into a common nationality. Bandhopadhyay, he says, nationalism is a site of contestation. And he even cites or quotes Homi Bhabha here. Nation building is always a process of continuous adjustment, accommodation, and contestation. It is from this historiographical position of recognizing the multiplicity of responses rather than assuming any unilinearity or single sequence of progress that we will look at the emergence of nationalism in post 1857 India. So, this is how Bandhopadhyay argues and talks about these multiple or different approaches. Thank you very much for watching.